It's now early 2025, and last Sunday, January the 12th, I had the pleasure of sharing my father and my family story on the Veteran Nation podcast with Mike, the skipper, and TC. Uh, Following up with that, I wanted to share a little snippet from that podcast to give some additional background context to how my father's Chinook ditch at sea story was discovered. And because for nearly 35 years since 1975, this was our own family story. The family story that was shared around the dinner table was eventually discovered by the U.S. Navy Mr. Jan Herman, U.S. Navy historian, and was documented in his book, The Lucky Few, and eventually the U.S. Navy produced a documentary with the same title. And then a few years later was fortunate to share the story again with Rory Kennedy and Moxie Film. And the film Last Days in Vietnam was nominated for 2015 Oscar nomination. And so with that said, here's the rest of the story. And I'll put the link to the full podcast in the description below. Thank you again, Skipper and TC, for this podcast interview. And in 2009, I'm sitting at work and I get an email from my mom. Her English isn't very strong enough to get by, but she forwards me this email, and at the bottom of the email was a email from the U.S. Navy. And it just so happened that the gentleman who initiated this email, his name is Mr. Jan Herman, another name that I want to just be grateful for and appreciate and give kudos, a shout out to Mr. Jan Herman, U.S. Navy historian. And his task back then, 2008, 2009, was to look at, the military activity, how the Navy would, and learn, right? Learn what worked, what didn't during the Vietnam era war. And he discovered this story about the USS Kirk and the ditch from the Chinook helicopter. And one of the things he wanted to figure out or find out was who was a pilot. And so he put this email together and put it out to the Virginia Vietnamese community. And somehow, some way, the story, got forwarded on to my mom. By this time, my dad was in the thick of Alzheimer's, so he couldn't reply. But I saw it, and it's like, oh my God, Mom, we finally got pictures of what Dad was saying. He wasn't lying when he said what he ditched it. We got pictures. It's like the joke that I would say. It's like when you go fishing with your buddy. Hey man, I caught like a 25-pound lingcod. Oh yeah, where's your picture? We got pictures, we got video. It's like, holy Toledo. So from then onward, the U.S. Navy, Mr. Jan Herman, put together the Lucky Few documentary, and it was finally aired. Or not, it was finally released in 2010, and we got invited to go to the USS Kirk reunion. And oh wow, it was it's total wow experience. The chance to shake and say thank you to the captain and to many of the crew member. And I remember my dad was in a wheelchair in 2010, and the painting that you saw from Mr. Adam Colts there, he painted it. Captain Paul Jacobs, presented that painting as a souvenir to my dad, our family. Folks in the crowd were clapping, and in the wheelchair coming up to the podium there, my dad basically was trying to work his way out of the wheelchair, and I kind of hey Dad, just no, don't worry, just But he got up. He was able to muster enough mental capacity, dementia and everything at this point, but just enough to stand up right out of his wheelchair and to a simple salute to the captain and the crew. And I knew that it came full circle for him in terms of just thanking the captain and the ship. And yeah, yeah.
I just I want so much for people to take away from this um how completely blessed as Americans we are, at white, black, native, First Nations, Asians, Asian Pacific, whatever the case might be. Um, just how blessed we are to have been born and raised here and not had to have experienced what your family went through, what your dad in particular went through, what your mom in particular went through. And I have a person that I listen to. He's a political philosopher, and he talks an awful lot. And you had mentioned some of the division here in the country. Um, it's really hard to get worked up and bent out of shape about microaggressions when you've lost almost everything and had to start over. And that's what's so inspiring about your family story. This isn't just about your dad, about this Vietnamese lieutenant colonel pilot who did an amazing thing. Just